确定。
Almost finished.
Okay, habt ihr es? Dankeschön. Okay, Dankeschön.
Please welcome to the stage Dennis Snower, President of the Global Solutions Initiative.
Chancellor Olaf Scholz, it is such an honor and pleasure to have you among us. You are an old-timer here. You have been here multiple times as finance minister, and it is wonderful to have you in our midst. In the period that you have been Chancellor has been an extremely eventful one, and in our work we have been truly inspired by what you have done in many respects. Your tireless efforts for social justice, which we share, the substantial contributions you've made to climate action under the G7 and elsewhere. And you have given a big impetus to our international communities in your tireless efforts to solve global problems globally. So without further ado, we look forward to your speech. Welcome.
Professor Snower, Mr. Walker, friends, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to be back at the Global Solutions Summit. It's great because our public debates are too often focused on the problems and not on the solutions. And even more often we are looking at them from a very domestic perspective. In our interconnected, interdependent world, this is simply not enough. That's why a summit like yours, focusing on both the solutions and their global nature, is so useful. No matter where you come from or which field you work in, climate action, global governance or migration, fighting poverty or advancing human rights, all of these pressing challenges have one thing in common. We will only be able to address them successfully if we find new ways of global cooperation. The international order as we know it faces tremendous challenges. Russia's brutal war against Ukraine might be the most brazen and outrageous attack on it, but it's by far not the only one. International law and rulings by international courts are being ignored. Universal human rights are being dismissed as regional interventions. Nuclear proliferation poses a growing threat in East Asia and the Middle East. I could go on with this list. So the million-euro question before us is, how can we maintain an international order based on the UN Charter and on international law in the 21st century? Now we are here to talk about solutions. And for me, the first part of the solution is this. Any effective international order needs to reflect the world's multipolarity. The unipolar, or bipolar world of the past might have been easier to organize, at least for those who held the power. But it's not the world we are living in anymore. Countries in Asia, Africa, and the Americas have growing populations and economies. Hundreds of millions of people globally have lifted themselves out of poverty and joined the middle class. They have every right to aspire to the same level of prosperity, participation, and global influence that citizens in Europe and North America enjoy. That's what a global order in the 21st century needs to reflect. The good news is that an overwhelming majority of countries in the world agree on the principles that such an order must be built on, with some notable exceptions, Russia being one of them. We all agree on the prohibition of the use of force in international relations. We want to see the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of other states respected. This view is also shared by those countries which were not sitting at the table in San Francisco in 1945 when the UN Charter was adopted. Only 10 years later, in Bandung, Indonesia, many of those countries from Africa and Asia raised their voices for self-determination, territorial integrity, sovereignty, and a world without colonialism and imperialism. What else are we trying to achieve when we support Ukraine against Russia's attack? But why then, some of you might ask, do some of these countries hesitate to criticize Russia more openly? Why did influential countries such as India, South Africa, or Vietnam abstain from the relevant UN resolutions calling on Russia to end its illegal invasion? These questions deserve an answer. When I talk to leaders from those countries, many assure me that they are not questioning the underlying principles of our international order. What they are struggling with is the unequal application of those principles. What they expect is representation on equal terms and an end to Western double standards. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that all of these claims are always justified. But we must address them if we want to encourage the powers in Asia, Africa, and the Americas to join us in building and defending a stable global order. So what does that mean in practice? First, we need to substantially broaden the scope of our engagement with this global South. If countries get the impression that we only approach them because we are interested in their raw materials or because we want their support on a UN resolution, it shouldn't surprise us that their willingness to cooperate is limited at best. Rather, our focus should be on what we can offer them and where our interests converge. One example is regional integration. No other region in the world is as closely integrated as the European Union, with its single market, its freedom of movement, and its strong political institutions. Countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean have embarked on a similar path with the African Union, ASEAN, Mercosur, CELAC, and other organizations. We as Europeans should offer them our unique experience and our support. That's what I did in my meetings with the African Union in Addis Ababa last week. Another huge opportunity to bring about a new relationship between Europe and the global South is the transition towards renewable energy. Within 2 decades, we'll be living in a solar, wind, and hydrogen-powered world. For many countries in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, which were once importers of fossil energy, this creates an enormous opportunity to boost their own carbon-free industrial development and in some cases even become energy exporters. This success lies in our very own interest. After all, one key lesson from Russia's war against Ukraine is what we have to avoid: one-sided that we have to avoid one-sided dependencies and diversify our energy supply. For that, countries in the Global South must have access to the technology and the capital that is needed to develop climate-friendly energy and industry sectors, access that we can provide. This is one of the key issues we'll be addressing in the International Climate Club that we founded during our G7 presidency last year. Chile has recently joined Germany as co-chair, and I'm delighted that other emerging market economies have also decided to come on board, for instance, Indonesia, Colombia, Kenya, and Argentina. Dependencies don't only exist when it comes to energy. Many critical minerals are essential for the global transition to a climate-neutral future. Right now, a handful of countries control most of the market simply because the raw materials are being processed there and not in the countries of origin. The countries of origin have every interest in changing that, and we have every interest in diversifying our supply chains. So why are we not working together to locate more processing steps where the raw materials come from? That's why we would not only create greater local prosperity, we would also ensure that our economies have more than just one supplier in the future. If that means adjusting EU trade policies and agreements, we should be open to doing so. This could serve as a model for fair and mutually beneficial trade partnerships in the future. This leads me to the second point we need to address: representation, or rather the lack of thereof. As long as the emerging powers feel that they are overlooked and underrepresented in the international system, they won't fully commit to defending it. That's a question of buy-in and inclusivity. Fixing this will require institutional reforms. Germany explicitly supports Africa's demand to have more seats and also permanent members on the UN Security Council. I also agree with the chairman of the African Union that the African Union should join the G20 as a formal member. And I hope that the G20 summit in Delhi in September will formalize this important step. The summit can also be instrumental in making our international financial institutions fit for the 21st century. Given the magnitude of the transformation ahead, we need them to boost private sector investment. The World Bank in particular could be a frontrunner by advancing the global transformation towards climate neutrality and continuing to fight poverty. How to get there is part of the discussions that we are having ahead of the G20 summit in Delhi. And there's more we can do. Not every step towards greater inclusivity requires cumbersome institutional reforms. As you might know, we used our G7 presidency last year to include leaders of the Global South in our discussions. Indonesia as the then chair of the G20, India as the incoming G20 presidency, Senegal as head of the African Union, South Africa as Africa's voice in the G20, and Argentina as chair of Latin American and Caribbean states. And the results of our meeting reflect that inclusivity. We set up the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment as a sustainable development offer to the world. We established the Global Alliance for Food Security to protect people from hunger and malnutrition. We launched the Global Shield Against Climate Risks together with the Vulnerable 20, the group of countries most affected by the impact of climate change. And we concluded new partnerships with Indonesia, South Africa, and Vietnam to help their societies and economies in a just transition towards renewable energies. And I'm glad that the Japanese G7 presidency intends to build on these achievements at our upcoming summit in Hiroshima at the end of this week. In Hiroshima, the G7 will assure Ukraine of our unwavering support for as long as it takes. Yeah. Take steps toward creating secure and resilient economies based on partnerships with the Global South. And act on the challenges faced by developing and emerging markets, ranging from the urgent threat of the climate crisis to the critical need for infrastructure. I will also remain personally committed to working towards a more inclusive, more equitable global order, particularly when it comes to our neighboring continent, Africa. That's why I will invite African leaders and other global representatives to join me here in Berlin on the 20th of November to advance the G20 Compact with Africa. The Compact's goal is to stimulate economic growth and to encourage private investment in Africa. It remains as valid as ever. Its potential, though, has only grown, as I witnessed firsthand during my trip to East Africa last week. Because of Africa's young and growing population, and because many African countries are embracing the energy transition as an opportunity for them. So here's my conclusion. Yes, there are many challenges to our existing international order, probably more than ever before in the past 8 decades. And at the same time, the potential for global cooperation on equal terms was never greater than today. That's the dichotomy of our times. Our focus should be on unlocking that potential, just like you are doing through your work. So thank you for being part of the global solution, and now I'm looking forward to our discussion.
So much, Chancellor Scholz, and thank you, everyone. My name's Richard Walker. I'm with Deutsche Welle, Germany's international broadcaster based here in Berlin. Delighted to have this opportunity to speak here at the Global Solutions Summit. We have a little podium to stand by here. So, Chancellor Scholz, I'd like to dive right in, first of all, before we get to some questions which we've got from some members of the audience here, which we'll be coming to in the next 20 minutes or so. But first of all, I'd just like to pick up on something that you said in your speech, and I really found interesting. It's certainly something that I, as a reporter traveling in the world, hear a lot. That was that the West has to kind of end its double standards. When it goes around the world talking about sovereignty and territorial integrity, essentially there's a credibility issue there because of what's happened in the last 20 years or so. So I just want to ask, before we get to those other questions, what can the West do to repair that credibility? Does this call for a more honest reckoning than there has been so far with the legacy, particularly of, say, the Iraq War, of the Afghanistan War? Would it help clear the air if the United States, if Joe Biden came out and said, sorry?
So first, we were in Afghanistan as well, and this was defending a threat to the international order and helping a country to develop a democracy, which failed in the end, as for many reasons, as we know. But I will be very clear on this topic. The first thing is that we are very honest with the past, and so let's be very clear. Colonial times are not that far away from today as many people in Europe think. Just if we remember the time of building the European Union and the first times of the European Community of Steel and Coal, it was at that time that many of the members joining there were still colonial powers. And many of the colonies just ended in the 50s, 60s and 70s of the last century. This is not far away. So we have to be very sorry about that. And this is, I think, the basis for the debate of double standards. And in the time when many of the European countries moved away from monarchy or from absolute power of the monarch, and developed the first times of democracy and all the basic rules we are looking at today, they were still selling men as slaves. So this is a truth we should know and we should be able to speak about. And the second is, if you want to be accepted, you have not to go there to an assembly and address the assembly saying, so we are now like this. You have to be continuously doing the same things for a long time. I think this is, if you love someone, you have to be continuously saying you are doing it, and you have to prove it for a long time. And this is what we are starting today.
But I'm just about to take one question from the audience, but just first, quickly, I mean, of course, the Afghanistan, there is a difference between the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war, but I know certainly from travels in India that the Indians were not particularly impressed by the way that the international community, the West, pulled out of Afghanistan. As the German Chancellor, you were finance minister when that happened. What would you say about that?
I think the big problem was that there was not a process starting earlier. And I'm really still very sad that so many that were in power in Afghanistan just did not defend their own country and the democracy, and so that this was working so fast that the Taliban are now ruling the country, and that women have no chances, that human rights are disobeyed, and all these things that are coming out of this. So we have to reflect on this. But I will quote Joe Biden. I think this is an important sentence in international politics, and possibly this is important for an outlook. He said there will be never a politics following the idea of regime change coming from outside to a country. And if we look at the needs for the safe security order of the peace order of the future, two things are essential. The first is we should insist that governments should be not revisionists. So changing borders by force is a threat to the global peace order wherever it happens, and no country should do things like that. And this also is why the question of Russia's aggression against Ukraine is a global question. Because if Russia would succeed, this is a message to many strong states to look at their neighbors and to eat them. And we have to avoid this as a message coming out of this war. The next is, I think, that we should be very clear that what was, I think, starting with what some men in England got from their king, habeas corpus, that if you are dissenting with your government, you are not in the threat of being put into jail. I think this is something which is also necessary for international peace order. This is what we could ask for, and this is what we should demand from any government and every country in the world. But aside of this, which way they will take is a decision by the people. And we should be very, very clear. As a country that made it to democracy, and started with this in the 19th century to get there, and coming from the party that was fighting at that time against authoritarian regime of the then emperor, it is absolutely clear that is something which we will support, but which has to be done by all the people by themselves, and this is what is the basis for a global international order.
Right, let's get to some questions from the audience. I would like to turn to Agnes Kalabata. She is from the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa with an important question.
Thank you for having me, Your Excellency. My question is, globally, challenges continue to rage on. We have hunger in Africa that is going on unabated and other developing parts of the world. We have the debt crisis and the climate change that are eroding previous investments. And we have government's capacity completely being eroded when it comes to ability to invest in people, especially if you live in Africa. So my question to you is, the financial systems are not working for us. We also don't see solutions that are being put in place that we believe are putting forward a credible agenda in the very near future. So as a former Minister of Finance, Your Excellency, who did a great job in terms of supporting your countries during the COVID-19 crisis and supporting Europe, and someone we look up to, what do you see is the silver lining for us that live in this type of challenges in the immediate future? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think there is a need for a debate on the global financial order and how countries can finance their own development. Many things have to be looked at. I think one is the ongoing process of reform the World Bank is planning. There is a public debate on this question, and it's very important, and we very much support the ideas that are discussed there. The second is that the lenders, the countries that give the money to others, have to find a new order, and that they give, and just to say it, the West learned about its mistakes and built the Paris Club to manage the process of giving money to countries and finding ways how they could be paid back. This was a big reform after big mistakes were made before. Now new countries are coming to lend money to others, and possibly they have much more money involved as it is now managed by the Paris Club. And this is why we have to find an order where this process of learning which we did is now including all the others that are active on the global market and giving money to countries and private investors and so on. And this also will mean that we have to find a way of cooperation. This is the idea between the common framework within the G20, which I think is really a progress. And if I see it right, we are making more progress because there is not the request anymore to, if there is a restructuring necessary, to include the development banks. And just for one reason, this would be a big mistake. They would not be able to continue with their activity if their special privilege in this case would be a discussion. And so I think having got this near agreement, I think we can go into concrete agreements with countries, and we are very happy that some, especially of the African countries, are now discussed about that there is discussion of restructuring ongoing. And we should continue with that because there is too much money that is used for not very fruitful investments and government activities in the past, and we have to come back to a very more serious way of support. The last, I think, is that we need to always understand that beside of public investment, private investments will be key. Just looking at Germany, we are doing a big transformation. And within this big transformation, billions, hundred of billions of investment will be necessary to transform the way of producing energy with offshore wind, onshore wind, with solar, to investing into our grid, to do investments into the industrial infrastructure, building steel in a different way, doing different ways of producing chemistry, and so on. But if we are doing this, we have to understand that these hundreds of billions will be private investment. And all the government support we are always discussing about will be just a small part of the most necessary things to be done. Understanding this, and this is the last sentence, I would say we need to create an atmosphere for private investments where companies are ready to do this because they are sure that all the treaties they sign will be fulfilled, that agreements about payment will be not questioned, and that they can get their money in and out. And this is the idea of compact with Africa. And this should be the conclusion of this. We have to do also this for having more investments into, for instance, the African continent.
So I would like to stay in the Global South and turn to Ambassador Sujan Chinoy, who's the chair of the T20 India, following on from that.
Thank you very much, Excellency, for your thought-provoking remarks. You spoke with great candor, and your remarks also demonstrated deep empathy for the global south. So my question to you, sir, is how can Europe, especially Germany, support the global south agenda to which Prime Minister Narendra Modi attaches great importance during India's G20 presidency? And by this I mean not only a just and equitable green transition, but also the reforms of the multilateral financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and especially addressing the debt distress in a large part of the world, particularly the low and middle-income countries that are badly affected today.
And just before you answer, Chancellor, we're running out of time a little bit. I'd like to bring in a couple more questions, so maybe we'll make that as short as possible given the scope of the question. Please go ahead. No, I just meant we'll bring in a couple more questions. We're running a little short of time.
Yeah, so I will be very short answering you. First, yes, the most important thing is we will support the Indian G20 presidency to be a success. And this is what we started to do when we were acting together in the last year, but we will continue to do so. And with my visit in India, I tried to be helpful in this agenda. And the second is that I think we are going to discuss the necessary reforms. I already spoke about World Bank reform process, which is taking place there. And we are very much willing to do the steps that will help that there is a fair international financing order.
Because I would like to move straight on to Dean Tetsushi Sonobe for the T7 chair from Japan.
Thank you very much, Chancellor. So as you know, many developing countries compare assistances from the G7 members and China. And some developing countries abstained from the United Nations voting against Russia's invasion in Ukraine. So when the relationship among developing countries and major powers becoming somewhat similar to the Cold War type relationship, what principles the G7 members should G7 members have to navigate their cooperation with developing countries?
Yeah, thank you for the question, but we have some members of G7 from the European countries, and there is a very good and intense cooperation between all the members of G7, and I'm very proud that the Japanese presidency is now working hard to continue with what we started, to open up to the global south, and with the invitation of Indonesia, India, South Africa, Senegal, and Argentina to the G7 meeting here in Elmar, we started with this. But this is something that, as far as I understand, will be continued with the G7 presidency of Japan and will be very helpful and the right thing to do. On the other hand, I think we have to avoid a new split or Cold War. But this is something where we have to act. And it means, at the first place, that we find a way how we can convince countries that they have to stick to the principles I spoke about, not being revisionist, not to try to change borders by force, and to act according to the idea of rule of law and the basic principles of democracy. And that's one of the questions to be tackled, and I think we will be able to do this. And the last thing, understanding that the world we will live in is a multipolar world, as I tried to say in my speech. It is not bipolar, not tripolar or something else. It is multipolar. But it is not a good place to live in if we are not making it multilateral. That cooperation is key, but looking at the principles, for instance, of the United Nations.
I mean, you emphasize in your speech, of course, that you have this vision of a multipolar world, but the forces of this kind of bipolarity that we're seeing between the US and China are very powerful, a very deeply problematic relationship at the moment. Just before we turn to our last question in just a moment, how concerned are you that, I mean, we're living through a war that few feared would happen in Europe. How concerned are you that in the coming years there could be a war between the US and China? that Cold War turns hot?
But first, it depends on all of us and how we act. And no one is planning for something like this. If I understand the United States President correctly, he is not acting into this direction. He has no plan like this. So the perspective must be that we are absolutely sure that obeying international law and sticking to the common rules of international order, being not revisionist, is the key for all what we can reach. And the next is that we are looking that the rules we are discussing should be followed at all places. So if we discuss about on fair level playing field, it is something that must be done in all partner countries. This will help as well. And the third is we should not misunderstand the reality. Just if we look at the rise of Asia that happened in the last 30 years, which is a very good thing to the world, it is not just about one country. There's also South Korea, there's Japan, there's Vietnam, there's Indonesia, there's the Philippines, there's Thailand, there's Malaysia, there's India, just to name some. And they will be very big and very strong nations all by themselves. And they will not accept that one country, even not one country of Asia, will rule them. And so this is something where we have a basis for good work.
So just before we finish then, last but definitely not least, the Young Global Change is a very important part of this summit. I would like to turn to Oluwadamilola Akintoye.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chancellor. Africa is considered the youngest continent, and I am from Nigeria. However, where 70% of our population are currently under 30. This young population offers an enormous opportunity. But now that Africa joining the G20 is in conversation, my question is, how can Germany boost investment in Africa to take advantage of this talent pool? Or how can the G20 and the G7 support African youth in the terms of policy making and decision making? Thank you.
Thank you. And really it is impressive to see how many young people are growing up in Africa. Many of them very skilled, as I learn at my visits in African countries, and which we can see if we look just at the figures. So it is absolutely right what you're saying. There is a lot of basis for prosperity of the countries, but for all of us on the globe. And so there should be a lot of activities we should undertake. And just looking at Nigeria, that you mentioned as your country, some people say in the midst or nearly after the midst of the century, this will be 500 million people. I don't know whether this is the truth, but it will be many people living there. So my perspective is first to create an atmosphere for investments, and especially also direct investments that can take place in the countries. And the basis for all of this is much more, as many people think, not public investments, which we can support. It is a good atmosphere for investors that they are sure about the economic circumstances. So I always try to explain people that they should understand business right. It is in one question completely different as many think. The first question a company investing in a country is doing is not what are the profits I could look for. This is a question they are looking for, but not as the first. The first is, will I get my money back? And the second is, if I have an agreement that I can start with my investment next year, will it happen in next year, or will it happen 5 or 10 years later? And creating an atmosphere where this is happening would be the best for the youth in Africa, because then the only thing they can look for is not migration, but working on the future in their own country. And this is, I think, key for all progresses we are looking for. Third, we should be very honest. So just looking at this war Russia started against Ukraine, what did we learn from the war? Also, we learn that most of the fertilizers are produced in a very small number of countries. And why are there not big production sites for fertilizers in Nigeria? In other places of Africa, there is a planning in Kenya where I was, in South Africa, for instance, many other places, and also in the South of America or in other Asian countries, to give the chance for a local production, which also makes these countries and their neighbors more independent from the supply from special countries. Last but not least, I think we have to find a very fair agreement on migration, which is also part of what can be done. Not that all people go, but that those who want can go, because in many of the countries, due to the fact that 70%, as you say, are under 30, even if there's a big growth, even if there is a big growth of jobs, it will not happen that all people will find something that is sufficient for them. And so we have to find fair deals. And I'm just trying to develop something which could be a new partnership with countries of origin and the countries where there is a request for labor, as for instance in mine. We are looking for more than 6 million people working extra in Germany coming from abroad up to the beginning of the 30s. So there is something that's not solving all problems, but some of them. And the only thing we try to have migration partnerships, which are very clear, that people can come on a very regular basis and fair agreements on migration for work, but that the countries that get access to this partnership are also ready to take those people back who cannot stay here because of legal reasons. And if this is something we can do, I think this could also help a little to develop countries. Thank you.
Okay, and so we're having to call time now. So interesting to talk to you. That we could have carried this on for much longer, but I'm going to ask Professor Snow back up onto the stage. Thank you very much, Chancellor Scholz. Thank you.
Chancellor Scholz, this was a very inspiring speech and very inspiring discussion. And I think your honest, open-minded, humble approach to statesmanship is a true inspiration to all our communities here to help solve global problems in that spirit. And in that regard, I'd like to hand over to you our latest Global Solutions Journal that contains our latest insights. And I'd like to thank you very much indeed.
So this happened. Now I've got 2 microphones and it's 3. I don't need that many. I'm going to put this here.
Good to meet you.
Please give the Chancellor a second to leave the room. And while you remain seated for just 30 seconds or so, I'm going to tell you what happens next. Thanks to all of you, we finished this session on time. So this gives us another 5 minutes to take a breath, to take a decision where you want to go next. In the live stream, are you live streamed here? The session Transforming Global Value Chains is up next with my colleague Declan Curry. And for all of you, make your way to the auditoriums if you want. You've seen that we mean the dialogue and deep dives, so it's not packed. Be early if you want to be there on time, and I'm going to leave you to it. Make your way, so I'm going to see you back on stage in a second.